and that's how I got those pictures from Colonel Bishan and others. But you're right. I mean, that's one thing that I haven't found, because they were the ones who had come at that point of time, which I mentioned in the book as well. And that, but I don't know whether they're still, and that's how I got those pictures from television and others.
Yes.
But you're right. I mean, that's one thing that I haven't. Sorry. So I'll revert on this, sir.
Okay, fine.
Found, because they were the ones who had come at that point of time, which I've been.
Actually, my unit, my company had come on 2 successive issues of Life.
Okay. Okay.
So actually, you might find it in the USI library in Delhi.
Yeah, I went
library
there.
has got a lot of this thing. Have you checked there, sir? The USI.
I checked there. They gave me a capsule that came in black and white, outlined.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Not colored.
Okay, so great, sir. It's 4:33. We'll follow the rules of the army here. We will start on time, as we always try to do. We try to finish it on time as well. Today is a lovely, beautiful evening here in Delhi, where I am. And in fact, we have Colonel Thapar here as well, whose mention is in the book that we're going to talk about today. My name is Mohit. I'm from City Book Leaders. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today we go back into history, and that too something that we have never been spoken much about. It's not much available on internet as well. But then today the book that we're going to discuss is very unique, because this is a very well researched book. It brings out a completely new aspect of how the world, and especially India, was, and when it comes to talking about the Indo-Sino relationships. We welcome you for this discussion on 1967 war with China, which India won. And the base of the discussion is Probal Dasgupta's book, Watershed 1967, India's Forgotten Victory over China. With the author, we have 2 very eminent personalities, as Colonel Thapar, whose book Vijayant at Kargil has been announced as the most inspiring book by us at the CBL, which is an encouraging tale of his son Vijayant Thapar, co-authored with Neha. This session is officially hosted by another very eminent person, Vice Admiral Muralidharan AVSM, who took our request to be the host for this session. Both the 3 gentlemen make this entire panel one of the most experienced and erudite one to discuss the book. What I will do at this point of time, that before starting the session, I'd like to read a quick intro of the book, which we are going to discuss today, which is Watershed 1967. The book, on the flap, on the front cover, it says, and there are a few lines which set the context of the book. What happened when India and China last went to battle with each other? China won. Absolutely wrong. India won. The sole India-China conflict that remains etched in our collective memory is the 1962 war, which India tragically lost. But 5 years later, in 1967, India and China faced off once again in the heights of Chola and Nathula at the Sikkim border. This time, overcoming the odds, India triumphed. The fallout of these forgotten battles was immense. Chinese shied away from actively allying with Pakistan and the US during the 1971 India-Pakistan war. And despite several standoffs in the half-century since then, Beijing has never again launched a military offensive against India. This incredible book tells us why these battles ushered in an era of peace. Full of thrilling international intrigue and nail-biting battle scenes, which I'm sure you will see once you see the pictures in the book. This book is based on extensive research and interviews with army officers and soldiers who participated in these historic battles. It aims to rectify a blind spot in history and shine the spotlight on a story of incredible bravery that India should be proud of. And that's exactly why we thought this book should be discussed. In fact, today is one of those sessions, or history book club sessions, where our members come and talk about books that inspired them. And we recently had one of our very dear friends speak about this book, and he spoke with so much passion about the book that this is a book which should go into our school syllabus as well. And that's where we thought it would be very, very nice to have the author, and that too with the 2 very eminent personalities to come and discuss about the book. Before we get into the discussion, I will just wear the hat of being a historian and also kind of a pseudo-economist, where I love to connect the dots, what's happening in the world. This was a year when I was not born, but certainly because of love of history, I can travel the world whenever it was. I can sit in a time machine and I can go back. So I will just took out some very prominent things that were happening at that point of time, some incidents that were actually happening, and why this 1967 war was so important, why it happened, and also what happened post that. I'll quickly quote something from whatever I have understood after reading some histories of energy, the history of the space war, and the Cold War as well. So if you see 1965, I'll talk about two or three specific years. 1965, the Vietnam War. And the first troops that actually entered Vietnam were not US, they were Australian. They were deputed from there. Again, a very interesting story about it. The mission to Mars started 1965, and the space wars were picking up like anything, as if they were trying to find some minerals and some energy, which is not possible on this country, on Earth. This was the same year, if you see the entire map at that point of time, Singapore was in the making. Same year, India tried getting into Lahore and Pakistan tried to get into Kashmir a big time. Same in time, Vietnam War, China shot down a US bomber. Something more about the Indonesian communist regime was in shambles. It was just getting over. Also, that was the same year when the Border Security Force was formed. And then the initial days of 1966, the remarkable, most memorable Tashkent happened. Same year, almost a few days after that, and I'm bringing back the discussion to energy, that's what I understand. The Air India flight crash happened. Homi Bhabha died in that crash, the father of Indian atomic energy. That's the same time when the Russia's investments into energy and space was skyrocketed. Same time, Indira Gandhi visited Moscow. This was the start of also just after this happened the Red August of Beijing with Mao Zedong. And the most notable that I could remember on the world map, that was the same time when the Arabs started talking about oil pricing, and they were out there in the battle to talk about why the pricing difference was there. And if you realize the initial years of 70s, the oil embargo happened. That's where 1967 is important. Just before that, China tested its first hydrogen bomb. And that's how, and if I will now actually show you a slide which will actually talk about the importance of 1967 in terms of its strategic location. And that's how we will start our discussion. If you see on this map, that's where Sikkim stands for. That's where this 1967 war started, a very, very strategic location. And with this thought, I think that's how the idea of the entire connect of the world economy to the strategic location of this place is pertinent. Getting into this part of the country as well as controlling this entire part would definitely make a good plot to know why this war was so important, and also what happened post that China never thought of getting into any kind of serious skirmishes with us. With this note, I welcome Vice Admiral Muralidharan. He needs no introduction. It has already been sent to all the people who have joined in today. I now request him to take over the session and for his views, a keynote by Colonel Thapar and a discussion with author Probal Dasgupta. Ladies and gentlemen, I now introduce Vice Admiral Muralidharan to all of you. Sir.
Thank you, Mohit. At the outset, let me thank Mohit and City Book leaders for giving me this chance to be with you all this afternoon. It's not often that a naval officer gets to discuss army issues. Of course, between the three services, we always discuss joint operations, but here I am involved in a pure army operation at that stage. But let me go back and say, what is the importance of history? Why are we looking at, why are we learning history? There's a very famous quote, which most of us have heard, that it says that those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. Or what is actually said by the Spanish-born US author and philosopher, George Sanatana, was that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Churchill put it even more strongly when he said, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Now, that is the importance of history, why we should learn. Those in the armed forces are very familiar how much we learn about the military history, previous battles, learn our lessons from it. Therefore, But before I come back to 67 incident, what the book is all about, let me say, looking at the world today, it is very evident that China is and will remain a country which has an impact on India's geopolitical outlook in the foreseeable future. Its expanding presence in our neighborhood, whether it is virtually in all countries around us, whether it's Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Myanmar, everywhere they are coming in, maybe at the guide of helping them out or helping them out economically, setting up, but they are increasing their presence in these oceans. And they also have their naval forces more and more operating in the Indian Ocean region. Similarly, if you look at our own outlook, as the current as our Prime Minister talked about it, that we are now looking into the Indo-Pacific as one. Now, if you're going to go into the Pacific, you're again going to confront China there. Yet, despite all this, China is one of the least understood nations in our country, despite the fact that both of us are very ancient civilizations and there were historical linkages in the past. And today we share a very, very long border, especially that happened after China took over Tibet, which was a buffer zone till about 1950. Once that vanished, we have got very close. We got an extended border. And China has also emerged as a major economic power with increasing military capabilities. Yet, when we talk of Indo-China border issues, the first thing that comes to everybody, virtually every Indian's mind, including those who were not born at that time, was the impact of 1962, which has had on our psyche. And I think that is something that we need to get over. I'll come to that later. And but the dispute for all this really started in 1914, way back, more than 100 years ago. At the Shimla Accord, which was then the Britain, China, and Tibet sort of the McMahon line. The border never got settled because Chinese never ratified it. Thereafter, soon after our independence, when China also, the communist regime took over, in the 50s, there were a lot of discussions, but nothing could be settled. Then came 62, 67. Then after there was a gap when we came to 87. Then 2013 at the Daulat Beg Goldi. Then 2017 Doklam. And last year, 2020 was Galwan. But in all this, if you look at why was there a gap from 67 to 87, and we never really had many major skirmish after that in this. Some of you might refer to the Peace and Tranquility Accord that we had in Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's time, but very little gets spoken of in 67. While Mohit quoted history at that time, mind you, personally, I was studying in a Sainik school at that time, hoping to join the National Defense Academy soon. When the 67 came out, it was there in the newspapers initially, then it sort of slowly vanished. Of course, very soon the 65, and then of course, by the time we joined the NDA, a little later, the 71 came about. But what actually happened in 67, how did it impact us? What are the short-term and long-term implications? All these you can really make out when you read Probal Dasgupta's book, himself a veteran. But before I come to him, I would like to request Colonel Thapar to say a few words, because he was the man actually at Nathula at that time, around 65, sir, I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So I would request you to say something before we come to Probal. Over to you, sir.
Actually speaking, I am very grateful to Probal to have dug out these two incidents, that is the 65 and 67 incident, and brought it to the fore. Of course, the 65 action at that moment of time, when it was over, that gave such a big relief to the whole country that you'll be surprised that at Nathula, there were more journalists and cameramen, international press, and everyone else than the soldiers. So that was the kind of relief, not only at our national level, but at international level, that was felt that we had stood our test over there. So I'm firstly very grateful to him to have dug out these two incidents which had gone into oblivion, or almost. 67, of course, there was some, but 65 has definitely gone into oblivion. So with this book, it has been brought out again. So I'm grateful to that extent. Regarding the major point about China and India, I think I would be speaking very candidly on this issue, and that is that we have neglected our armed forces all the time. And ultimately, we try to say that China got the better of us. That is not the case. In all these skirmishes, not only did we have a skirmish in Nathula, but we also had a skirmish in Lipu Lake with 60 Chinese soldiers had come inside our border, and the company commander who had gone on the patrol, he asked me, what am I to do? I asked, should we open fire because we are in a advantageous position? But it was denied. So that is the kind of situation in which we put our own armed forces, and then we try to get equal with the Chinese. Whether it was 62, sadly, I was there in 62, just commissioned. We were having 303 rifles, if you don't mind. And the Chinese had AK-47s. So you can imagine the quantum of firepower that one had and the other people had. Similarly with other equipment. As a matter of fact, if I come to Nathula, we didn't have any mortar support. No mortars. And the Chinese had brought their 6 or 8 mortars at Nathula. So what we did was improvise. We made mortars of logs, defense stored logs, cut them and gave them a shape of a mortar and put camouflage nets so that when the Chinese open fire, it goes on to them and we are saved. So I believe that we are always having this bit of a, what shall I call it, to the enemy. We have certain an attitude of appeasement, Why we didn't do enough between 67 and the present date is very evident, that had we paid attention to this particular aspect, we would have been better off to meet them. Let me assure you, given all the wherewithal, we will always be one better over the Chinese. Certainly, always and every time I say that. So therefore, the real issue lies in keeping us abreast of the Chinese forces so that we can meet whatever challenge they throw at us. So that is all. There is major points. As we discuss further, I will come out to any other problems that I see.
Thank you, sir. Now I'll request Probal to speak to us a little about his book and tell us what it is, and then we'll take on to the further question.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. At the outset, I wish to thank City Book leaders and Mohit and the team for inviting me to be a part of this discussion today. Really privileged and delighted in equal measure to be here. So thank you very much.
Always be one better.
At the start,
I see.
Thank you.
I think there's some issue with the audio. I hope I'm audible. But so Vice Admiral Muralidharan and Colonel Thapar, sir, really a privilege to be here and on the same panel as you and to discuss the book. I would start by mentioning about something that the Vice Admiral just spoke about. He spoke about the writing of history and quoted from George Santayana. Just picking up from there, this is why, and I'll talk about why I say this is important as we speak about the book, is that this book is about history, and there is also, in the context of writing history, it is important that we write our history, else we would, else somebody else would write our history and we would not necessarily like that history. So if we need to tell our history, we need to write our history, or else somebody else will write it. As they say, there's an African proverb which says till the lions learn to write the history of the jungle will be written by the hunter. So till the lions learn to write, the history of the jungle will always be written by the hunter. And that's important, therefore, that we write our history and we tell our history to our people. Else the wars or the events, the specific periods kind of fade away. Colonel Thapar spoke about that period essentially again as ones that faded away with time. So Watershed 1967 is a story, a narrative of a period of history which lies between the defeat of 1962 and the victory of 1971. It is basically a narrative of a very transformative period in India's history that happened between 62 and 71, which is why the story of Watershed 1967 begins with 1965, begins with a time when that transformation was beginning to happen. Colonel Thapar spoke about 1962 and the 303 rifles, the Enfield rifles. Now, 1965 was the first time when the SLR rifles were introduced. 1965 was also the first time when India chose to attack another country. An independent India chose to attack another country after having weathered the initial storm of the attack of the enemy, which was Pakistan. And that was also the first time when two countries, we talk about multiple fronts today, that was also the first time when two fronts were opened up. We don't talk about the second front much, which is Sikkim, which is essentially what the book starts to talk about at the initial stages. So as everyone was focused on the Western front, India and Pakistan, and everybody was, and rightly so because a war was happening there, there was something that was going on the Eastern front. And that's where Sikkim comes into focus. Sikkim, as we all might remember, and Mohit showed earlier in that map, was not a part of India. And China had a plan as far as Sikkim was concerned. The book also, with the book, I intended to speak or write about what happened in the period preceding 1967, because it also tells us that 1967 was not an instinctive decision by the Chinese, or was not a flash in the pan, or not just some accidental event, but it was also an outcome of several pieces of drama that were happening since 1965, which was political, diplomatic, and military. There were all several pieces coming to fruition in 1967. It was also a time when the CIA was very much active in India. And that's why the book starts with an event in 1965, which also involves Kashmir, and which also involves an Indian politician, which also involves a CIA agent. Book starts in Jeddah, of all places. Book starts in Paris. It's about Sikkim and India and China, but it starts somewhere else. So you can imagine how how involved these several pieces in the puzzle were. That a Chinese premier met an Indian politician in an African summit and tells him about a plan involving Sikkim and Kashmir. And the plan was to push India on the back foot. There was also a context of 1967, which I intended to remind people. Today, we are a much more confident nation. We are a nation which takes on China, and Colonel Thapar spoke about the role of the army. The army has been performing its role in 1960s as well. It is something that I wanted to also put on record. The context of where we were in 1967, which is 5 years after the setbacks of 1962, psychologically, we were in a very different space. So 1967, therefore, was very important sorry, I got some voting here. So 1967 was very important to understand, therefore, where the Indian military leadership was, where the Indian political leadership was, and therefore to have taken a decision in 1965 by General Sagat, and in 1967 by General Sagat and the battalion commanders and the company commanders, Colonel Rai Singh, Colonel Joshi, to really take on the Chinese was a huge decision of that point of time. At that point of time, you can't compare it with today, because at that point of time, India psychologically was on a very different platform. And that turning point of 1967 set the template for India and China relations, set the template for historical, political, and military equations between India and China, took away the psychological edge that China had acquired in 1962. And that happened in 1967. There were certain decisions that were taken. I mean, I don't want to get into the details of what are there in the book, what all those details are in the book. But there's several pieces that combined to make 1967 important. What I want to highlight here is that those events which involved the diplomatic tussle between India and China, the Doklam issue, which actually happened for the first time in 1966 and not 2017. Mohit recounted a number of issues that were happening on the global front. In the region, there was Doklam that had happened for the first time in 1966. There was also, China had lit several fires across India, which is in the northeast. We talk about the Nakshal issue today. The Nakshal issue first reared its head in 1967, in early 1966-67, at that point of time in Naxalbari, very close to Sikkim in North Bengal. So a lot of things were happening, which when you look at all of them, they converged towards the battles of 1967. 1967 also is an important point in history. When you look at setting of the template between India and China, 20 years later, China again pushed India back at Sondorongchu. And in Sondorongchu in 1987, General Sundarji and General Sharma, who later on went on to become the army chief, took on the Chinese and heli-lifted an entire brigade and brought it up there. The playbook of 1967 and General Sagat was replicated in 1987. A lot of issues that happened in history are a result of 1967. The integration of Sikkim, for instance, because India realized that Sikkim was again a very vulnerable geographical space. Mohit showed in the map earlier what would have happened if China had captured Sikkim, and China had plans to do that. So 1967 essentially changed a lot of things. It's also a watershed year because historically it changed. Geographically, it's a watershed. It divides the Indian and Chinese territories along the geographical Himalayan watershed. Historically, it changed the pattern of relations between India and China. China had after that, for 50 years, China never mounted a confrontation against India, barring 1975 and 4 soldiers and a patrol were killed, until 2020. May, June 2020, for last 53 years, there's nothing that had happened of that scale. Also, apart from being a geographical and historical watershed, it's also been a military watershed, because after 1967, China, that was the first loss that China had. And after 1967, they've never, ever won a battle, because they lost in 1969 to the Soviets in the River Ussuri, on the banks of the River Ussuri. 1979, they had a hard time against the Vietnamese. Whereas for India, it started a series of different military results. And most of them, and I say most of them, India has had a long history of military confrontations with different kinds of adversaries. And the Indian army has always come out on tops. And I think that is why 67, again, is a historical, political, and military watershed in every respect. And I thought this was an idea whose time had come, a piece of history that the nation should know at this point of time. Over half a century had happened of peace had transpired between India and China. And the reason for that goes back to that marker of history in 1967. So here it is, the Watershed 1967, and I'm very grateful to Colonel Thapar, who also figures in the book, and as he rightly mentioned on page 60 of the book, at an early stage of this whole confrontation. But I'm really grateful to all the veterans who I spoke with, the war heroes, the battle heroes, people who were there during that period, soldiers, some of the diplomats that I spoke with, and other sources who have been helpful in giving me their pieces, their versions, which helped me construct a narrative that hopefully would make for interesting reading for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Probal. I think while you covered a bit of it, so I think with a few of these, I'll ask a few questions. I'll also request Colonel Thapar to interject. First, Probal, while you have mentioned briefly, I'd like to know a little more about what really inspired you to write this book, though you mentioned it. And similarly, in your book, you talked about the Pak-China nexus, which happened 62, 65, there were threats, and then going after 67, 71, why they never came in. And then you also mentioned briefly about the Kissinger-Nixon US involvement in it, and the books by Lindner and Maxwell, and how Mao Zedong gave the book written by, I think, Lindner, which was the Chinese look at it, and how that book actually influenced, Kissinger to think that India was a very weak nation, and they should, and they were tilting more towards Soviets, so let them get hold of them with this thing. So can you throw some light on this a little briefly on these aspects from your book, what you have written?
Sure. So 2-3 aspects, and if I kind of miss out on anyone, please do remind me, sir. I think I'll just go one by one. So you asked me about my motivation to write this book. The journey started in 2017, and we were all glued to the India-China standoff at Doklam. What I realized at that point of time was that the entire media, whether it was the print media or the audiovisual media, and everyone else, whether it was journalists, columnists, commentators, and the entire discourse was fixated on 1962, as you brought it out earlier. 1962 seemed to be the epicenter of our reference to China for all practical reasons of history. We didn't seem to realize, and this is not the fault of A or B or C, it's just that how history has been recorded, narrated, and retold to us. I realized at that point of time, I was talking about this battles to my friend, and this is exactly how this is exactly why I wrote the introduction to the book. And it may sound, a very sensational opening, but that's how it was. The conversations were, when I asked people, who do you think, what happened when India and China went to battle the last time? And most people would talk about 1962. That's when I realized that this is an idea which needed to be told to people. This is a story that needed to be told to people, an idea whose time had come. I realized that a lot of people, whether it was historians, and I'm not just talking about people outside the military fraternity, it's historians, military historians, veterans, military officers, and of course, people outside. Most people were not aware of the battles of 1967. Even further, less number of people were aware of the relevance of 1967 and the impact of those battles on the course of history that followed between India and China. So that was my first trigger. That was my first motivation to instinctively think about writing something, documenting something, and that set me on a path to understand how this could be done. Secondly, I also realized that a lot of history had been written about 1971. Because India's stupendous victory brought it to our living rooms in terms of books, films, narratives, etc. So 71 was never going to go away. 1962 was a sore point in defeat, which we recalled to every time there was a standoff with China, and every time there was some issue with China, we went back to 1962. Every time there's an issue with Pakistan, we go back to 1971 and 1999 Kargil. But China also, there was an event of 1967 which we have shelved and forgotten. And I think we ourselves should take the blame to not being able to recall that over last 53 years. So that was one of the triggers. I realized that that transformative change between 1962 and 71 happened in that period. A lot had been written about 71, and a lot had been written about 1962 as well. The Himalayan Blunder is one of the biggest books of 1962, written by Brigadier John Dalby, and others followed. He spoke about Neville Maxwell, he spoke about Bertil Lintner as well. Several other historians have written. But the transformative period, what happened to the political and military leadership, that everything changed from the defeat and the setback of 1962 to the victory of 1971, was essentially in the period that lay within these two bookends of history, or these 2 years of history. Was bookended between them. And I think that's what led me as a researcher to understand more about this. The third reason was, when we look back at India and China, except for 2020, there's been a long period of uneasy peace. I'm not saying that, very friendly nations, but there've been 2 large nations, 2 very influential nuclear powers for the longest time, who hadn't gone on who hadn't had a confrontation for the last half a century. And I needed to understand what could have been the reason. There are several reasons. We have had protocols, we've had other aspects set into place. Those are academic reasons. Not saying 67 is the reason. But what I'm saying is, I wanted to go back to see what is the marker of history where all these confrontation, the confrontation between India and China ended. And that's 1967. And the reason why it ended was because India established parity. And with China, there is no, you cannot sort of have a diplomatic sort of a peace without establishing a military parity of some nature. In a limited conflict, India showed China that in a limited conflict, the Chinese would come out second best. They understood that against the Soviets in Ussuri in 1969. They understood that against Vietnam in 1979. What that did was also to tell China that, look, if you engage India in a limited conflict, and I'm limiting myself to that portion because 67 actually exemplified it, the Chinese wouldn't be able to really take on India. There are historians that have spoken about, that have written about this in 1968, 69, and subsequently as well. And which is also the reason that China never really mounted a military conflict, despite being provoked and despite being pushed back by India again in 1987 in Somdrongchu. So when you look at all these reasons, it actually intrigued me, surprised me, and baffled me that over half a century, no one had written about 1967. That's what set me on the path to write it.
Thank you, Probal. Would you briefly like to mention, so you have written the book about the US influence and how Kissinger thought that he could play with India, which you have mentioned briefly in your book.
Yes. So what happened was that, because at that point of time, the Cultural Revolution was very much rampant, and Mao was basically, he had taken on a lot of people. He had taken on India, he had taken on his rivals internally as well in the mid-60s, which led to 1967. It also so happened that the US and the Soviets were not on good ground. The Chinese and Soviets had also taken on each other in 1969. That is the time the US thought that our enemy's enemy should be our friend. And that's where, because the Soviets and China had again gone up against each other in Ussuri in 1969, another battle that's not spoken about much. And the Russians had actually decimated an entire Chinese brigade. Photographs from the moon talk about pockmarks and complete demolition on the Chinese side. It gave the US an opportunity to make friends with the Chinese. So when Henry Kissinger, who was the architect of, he had the Chanakyan bent of mind, the whole thinking process that, we could possibly get China onto our side, and also Pakistan, because that was that period when it was, it was happening, and he had already made friends with Pakistan. Gary Bass writes in his book on Bangladesh that, how Kissinger used Ayub Khan to make friends with China. Ayub Khan was then the president of Pakistan. And when he went to China, and this is where the India-China axis comes into play, next the India-China equation comes into play, and 1962 comes into play, that when he visited China, he was given a book by Zhou Enlai, and Zhou Enlai had given him the book written by Neville Maxwell on 1962. Now, Maxwell's book actually blamed India for the 1962 war. It is written, it's a scholarly piece of work, but I do not agree with Maxwell on several aspects, which Bertil Lintner points out in his book as well. But given that it was a well-written piece of work, and it argued why India was in the wrong vis-a-vis China, that book also is said to have driven Kissinger and President Nixon's understanding of the India-China equation at that point of time. It also led in 1971, during the India-Pakistan war in Bangladesh. At that point of time, Henry Kissinger and President Richard Nixon were urging, exhorting, almost begging China to push India at Sikkim to, to really raise the ante as far as India is concerned, to raise the pressure on India, which China did not do for various reasons. Mrs. Gandhi had signed a treaty with the Soviets. The Soviets had put 48 divisions on the Soviet-China border. Several things had happened, but psychologically, the Chinese couldn't even move a few troops across Sikkim in their own area, and not even posture against India. And what they had understood was that this was not an easy game. India was no more the army of 1962, which they had very well understood after 1967. But that book had actually pushed the US to think differently about China. And that book was about 1962. The one thing that was wrong about the book was that Henry Kissinger and President Richard Nixon were thinking about India and China in 1970-71 using the prism of 1962, which was there in the book. 8 years had passed, history had changed. That Henry Kissinger hadn't understood quite well at that point of time.
Thank you, Probal. Actually, talking of Henry Kissinger, while he had formed that, as I was briefly mentioning, years later, Kissinger totally changed his tone. In fact, in his 2014 book, when he talks on the world order, he actually appreciates India and its non-aligned attitude and movement which happened. He says they were able to get the best from both the blocs at that time, which happened. Of course, that's another occasion to discuss. But now, when I come to on this war itself, before I come to Probal, I'll ask Colonel Thapar to explain the two key things that has been mentioned in the book. That's about the leadership on the ground. In 65, we were actually being talked about, and the leadership there, we did, despite the political leadership telling us to back off, the army did not vacate Nathula in 65, though it vacated Jalapla. Similarly, in 67, again, it happened that because we stood firm in Nathula and Chola, etc., we were not really, how it impacted us. So I would request Colonel Thapar to give his views, since he was there on the spot initially on this, and then Probal could supplement it.
Well, I will go back to Probal. When he says that China has been constantly manipulating things in its favor, starting from Jeddah to Gangtok and other places. But look at our own selves. In his own book, as otherwise also, it is well clear that Sardar Patel had realized the importance of this particular piece of territory, Sikkim, and Tibet also, but we leave the Tibet out of it. But Sikkim, he had very specifically asked the government to integrate it into India as a part of the country, as another state of India. That would have reduced much of the ambiguity that came about later on. So that was not done. That is one big error. And that's what brings me again to my point about trying to appease, whether it is China or it is Pakistan. I'll recall the Shimla agreement where we went all the way to appease Pakistan. For what reason, I don't understand. We never got anything except that we created Bangladesh, but we could have at least made the international LOC into an international border. That would have deterred China from its mischief that it was getting involved into. So that is a very major point. The other point is the political, or at the highest level, this policy of appeasement puts a certain caution on the minds of the commanders and the troops. You see, and commanders like Sagat Singh are rare. I have been with him in 65 very intimately. I have also been with him in Bangladesh. So I know the man, and you don't get commanders like this what we require to do is to build the psychology of the commanders in a more potent and effective manner, that they can take on the issue at that point of time. He took it, but the other commanders at Jalapla did not take it. It never occurred to us that we have to withdraw from Nathula. We were just 23 men, mind you, 23 men at Nathula and 10 men at Sebula. And we are facing a battalion of the Chinese. So it never occurred to us that we have to go back. That is where the leadership comes in. So little weakness or little sense of not being equal may cascade into the kind of thing that happened at Jalapla. I was there when the big explosion took place at Jalapla. They had blown off the whole road. 1.25 kilometer of the road was simply blown off, and it caused the debacle. So we require people, like I was saying, General Sagat Singh was an exceptionally good commander. He could foresee, he could take action to see a tactical situation and take out the best from it. Now, that is where I again like to emphasize from his book only a very relevant point he has made. See, when the action started in the morning with the Chinese in 1967, between the time he wanted to use the artillery to the decision making to allow him to use the artillery, it would have taken 5.5 hours, and that thing never came. The permission to use artillery never came. The result was the casualties we suffered, the better results that could have come. In this particular action, artillery was very much a key component. And if we could have used artillery 5.5 hours earlier, you can see the consequences of that. What results it could have had on the battlefield. But that did not happen. So that is the moment we have more determined and officers who can take the decisions in their hands, and decentralization. How can the MOD have the decision making to open artillery fire? I don't understand, because the situation will change in that much time. Like anything, you have to work out your SOPs, and decentralize the power to the commander on the ground. So that is the other thing. And like I said earlier, that given the wherewithal, the Indian Army will produce the results and will never put the nation in a situation where we have to play the second fiddle. Never. That is very clear in my mind.
Thank you, Colonel Thapar. I think before since we are running out of time, it's very interesting. We could go on. But before we open to the audience questions, let me ask Probal, again, linked with this, and I'll also link a small portion of this, and when we could take it on, thereafter we could throw the. One is, you have written very extensively about, as Colonel Thapar, about General Sagat Singh. And so what is your impression that gets formed of the kind of leadership he provided, and also impact of leadership both at the national and field level? You again mentioned about in the book about Shastri as well as Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And then what we saw in much later in Kargil, which we discussed earlier in the other book discussion, about the young leaders on the spot, the soldiers, the kind of spirit they showed. You've covered it a lot in the book. For the rest of our audience, I would request you to cover it in gist, and also add a bit about the diplomatic incidents we had concerning later Ambassador Raghunath and Vijay, which happened there, and the counterproductive that happened in New Delhi. So when you cover both these, after that we'll take on the questions from the audience.
Sure. I'll cover them briefly. So General Sagat, Colonel Thapar spoke about him quite eloquently, and he's been there, and so he's seen him operate. So nothing like understanding from him how it all happened and how General Sagat was operating at that point of time, and also in 1971, which the book brings out as well. I just want to highlight here that General Sagat and his actions have, which the book talks about, 1961 Goa, 1967 and 1971. On each of these occasions and each of these events, he had to take a call in terms of taking on the adversary and using out of the box means or thoughts which he as a leader on the ground could have used the best. And he took a call. And I think that is what exemplifies or makes us look at him as one of the greatest battlefield commanders in history. In 1971, when the Pakistanis were not expecting, he used, he heli-lifted troops across the river Meghna, which you couldn't see the other side. And he did that and surprised the Pakistanis. That was not a part of the larger thinking, whether it was the leadership at a higher level that, you would do that. But General Sagat had taken that call. In 1961, the decision was not to capture Panaji, but to surround. And I think our decisions in terms of offensive tactics have never been have been defensive at certain places, and that is what General Sagat was in disagreement with. He decided to capture Panaji in 1961, decided to capture Dhaka in 1971. These were not decisions that were decided on the drawing board. 1967, similarly, I spoke about these two because when he come to 1967, his call to use the artillery was preceded by the movement of the arty guns up there. He had moved up the artillery guns because he anticipated, and I think that's the hallmark of a good leader, that you anticipate different kind of scenarios and you are ready to take a call. So he anticipated, he moved the arty guns. He had also had a chat with the arty OPs and had briefed them what they would need to do if the occasion went down a slippery slope. When Colonel Thapar brought out why the arty guns could have been used earlier, absolutely, I totally agree. And the way I look at it also is that, because he used the artillery guns and because he took a call, we talk about the battles in a different way today than we would have spoken about it, which could have been in a rerun of 1962, the way the Chinese had opened up at that point of time. General Sagat, before General Sagat's, before him, lay two options. One, to follow a protocol which was being dictated by Delhi and end in disaster, which had happened earlier in 1962 as well. And I don't want to go through that narrative. There's a lot written about it. Kunal Verma has written and others have written as well. So he had two options: either follow the protocol and wait for the decision to open the artillery, wait for Delhi's decision to open the artillery. The second option, which was to open the artillery, because that was a higher call. The higher call was, are you going to follow the protocol? Are you going to follow your call, that is to protect the sovereignty, integrity, and the of your country, which you have signed up to protect? Which was again 20 years later, General Sundarji and General Sharma decided when they told the MOD that, look, we cannot retreat because of the reasons that we feel we need to stay there and push the Chinese. So I think General Sagat's bold decision making in the battlefield, answering to the higher call of protecting one's country, was the reason why we had him as a general who always came out leading a victorious army in the various battles. So that is General Sagat, and he spoke about the young leaders on ground. So right from the battalion commanders, Colonel Rai Singh, Colonel KB Joshi, and the company commanders and the others, Captain Dagar, who gave up his life there, Major Harbhajan Singh. I think these are all examples of bravery that Indian Army has, has this entire historical narrative stretching from many decades to 1999 in Kargil. Colonel Thapar is someone who's more aware of it than I can even talk about. So there is this extensive stretch of history which we are extremely proud of, and it is because of these commanders on ground, the young officers on ground. We've been veterans, we've been in the forces, and we have seen how young officers operate without caring for their lives and actually lead from the front. And that is why Indian Army has highest number of officer casualties as compared to any other army in the world, because the officers lead from the front. And I think that's a great honor. And also the soldiers who actually are on the forefront of all these battles. And I think that 1965, Chola and Nathula exemplify that. The way at Nathula, initially after taking the hit, the battalion, 2nd Grenadiers, came back to take on the Chinese, and supported by the artillery, or the Gurkhas, the 11 Gurkhas at Chola, when they actually took the initiative and took the battle to the Chinese, broke through the Chinese. There's Devi Prasad Limbu's action, which the book starts with. The reason why I started with that is because here was a young soldier who decided that it is not China who's going to take the initiative, it is us. And that is when he decided the momentum of the battle that followed at Chola. I also wish to say that, over a period of time, we have relegated these battles as skirmishes. I actually protest the use of the word skirmishes to describe the battles of Nathula and Chola. And this has happened over the last so many years. We have not given those battles their place, and we have relegated them to skirmishes. Even today, many a times I hear many veterans talk about, and because that's the way history has recorded them. And I wish these battles are given their space and place in history for what they are and what they changed in history. So this is again something that happened at that point of time. Again, another event where the young soldiers, young leaders, young officers led from the front and brought India the laurels and honors. The third part, you spoke about the diplomatic fracas and the tussle that went on. That's an interesting piece of political drama, and also showed us how the political leadership had changed at that point of time. Because pre these battles of 1967, the diplomatic tussle that had happened, where Indian diplomats, Mr. Raghunath and Mr. Vijay, were branded as spies and had been put behind bars by the Chinese. And in India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi did tit for tat and put the entire Chinese embassy, in a lockdown, and had also denied, and so that almost led the two countries to a war. When the Chinese sent an aeroplane to take away the diplomats who India had declared as persona non grata, India denied them fuel or refueling facility, because India was also stepping it up. When 1966 Doklam happened, the Chinese walked into Bhutan trying to test India's mettle and ability to protect Bhutan. India did not waste a moment at that point of time. India stepped up the ante. So I think that also told China how the political leadership had changed from the time of Mr. Lal Bahadur Shastri 1965 to Indira Gandhi 1967. I also think that that change, though, had happened at the political level. At the political level, we have had several changes. some ups, some downs. What I want to reiterate is at the military leadership level, after 1962, the changes that have been brought about have only brought to the fore the ability of the Indian Army to take on an adversary in the most difficult of circumstances, given the fact that they have been involved in every kind of skirmish, battles, wars, and confrontations over the years. I think that is something that exemplifies the way the Indian Armed Forces have fought over a period of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Probal. I think Mohit, we can take on the questions, if any, from the before I come back to them later.
Definitely. And we have a very interesting question. And I would request Mr. Kiran Karnik to ask it directly to Probal and to the other two eminent panelists. Mr. Kiran Karnik is former ISRO, former NASCOM, and it's a privilege to have him here. Sir, please, your question.
Thank you, Mohit. First, Probal, congratulations. Very, very informative and inspiring talk. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. And, unfortunately, I haven't so far, but it really is certainly going to inspire people and give us a lot of history. As you rightly said, it's time we began to write history. And the history is not just of the, as you rightly put it, the hunter, but also of those who have suffered more than once. My question to you, Probal, and indeed to Admiral Muralidharan and Colonel Thapar, who have so much experience from different aspects of what is happening, is that, 67 was a great moment. And in 75, in many ways, we held our own. But since then, the military balance has changed very adversely, I would say against us. The Chinese economy is huge. Their spending on defense is 5 times ours, according to the figures that I have. And there is an imbalance. And I think it's difficult to deny that, despite the bravery of our soldiers and the tactics which our generals have so well employed, as we saw in Ladakh recently. But given this imbalance, would you think it makes sense, and this is addressed to you, but also to our other two panelists, do you think it makes sense for us to look for allies beyond the US, whom, very frankly, are, I don't think, as reliable as we would like them to be? And if so, who? I know I thought, but just wanted your thoughts and responses and ideas on that. Or do you think we can just go on our own? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karnik. I think that's a very relevant contemporary question. And thanks for the kind words. The more I look at history, the more I see a reflection of the contemporary issues in the mirror of history. That's the one way I'd like to start. In 1960s, and at that point of time, India had an ally in Soviet Union, and that happened in 1971. And to your question, in 1971, China did not interfere in the India-Pakistan war because we had an ally at that point of time called Soviet Union. So China and India definitely, again, at this point of time, are the bigger players in the region. Definitely China, with its size, its economy, its military, is not one that India would take on its own. That's very much evident, and that's what I believe. However, I also think that, the focus that was there in the 1960s of the world, which was a Cold War era, which is essentially Europe was the center stage, the playground of the Cold War. I have written somewhere that, today we are seeing Cold War II, where the center stage, the playground of that Cold War is not Europe, but is the Indo-Pacific. And when you're talking about the Indo-Pacific, we're not talking about South Asia alone. We're talking about the entire region, which has about 44% of the world's trade, about 60% of the population, and much of the exports, the largest numbers of trade pacts in this region of Indo-Pacific. And that's where India, the entire South China Sea and the countries around it, and whether it's the Indian Ocean region or the South China Sea or the Pacific region. So all the countries which are there, whether it is Vietnam, whether it is Japan, and I'm addressing your question, this is Vietnam, Japan, Australia, India, all of these countries have had a bone to pick with China. If you look at allies, you make allies or out of people who have similar concerns with your adversary. And today, India, unlike 1960s, where India was a part of NAM, India had a position where it was, slightly isolated. NATO was operating separately. Today, you have an India which is far closely aligned with the business interests and economic interests of Vietnam and Japan and the others. India also has a military alliance, which has not taken off as well. I mean, that's something the Vice Admiral would answer, probably want to respond as well. There's something called a Quad in the Indian Ocean region, where India is a part of an alliance which has had an academic sort of orientation, but it has not taken off, though the Indian Ocean region remains a major focus as far as India and its allies go. To your question, today it's not the Himalayas alone, or the conflict along the Himalayas, or confrontation along the Himalayas, that India and China would be really concerned about. It is the Indian Ocean region, a larger region, and that's where India plays such a major role, and that's where the allies play such a major role. And it's not the US. Yes, the US does play an important part here. And to your point, the US has been an up and down ally, and it has sometimes had the focus, sometimes not. But there are other countries, and you have the number of disputes that China is involved with different countries along the South China Sea and elsewhere. That's what gives India the a ground, a platform to have a larger alliance, which is beginning to take shape. It could take time, but then you have a Taiwan which is also raising its voice. You have the Philippines, whose economy, whose fishing economy has been curbed by the 9-dash line that China establishes in the middle of the South China Sea. So there are several of these. Japan has an issue, and there are the focus of outsourcing centers that are moving away from China. So the banking industry is moving away from Shanghai to more of Singapore. So I think those kinds of things India looks at as a larger integrated alliance, not just a military one, but more of an integrated geopolitical economic alliance that India could use to establish itself in the region vis-a-vis China. That's what I would think. Thank you.
Would you like to say something, Colonel Thapar, before I take on and this question? No, I think, thank you, Mr. Karnik. I think it's a very interesting question, but it's something which I thought I would say at the summing up, but I'll bring it forward. And here I go back to Kautilya. And when he talked about, the need for every nation, or for the nation to build a comprehensive national power, which would actually have your economy, military, governance, the attitude of the people, the whole host of things are involved in this. And what we need to do is, while in the late 40s or early 50s, China and we were somewhere together, but today they have actually, as you brought out, they're shot up economically. They have been able to spend a lot of money and, on building up their military. Now, of course, here over the years, our governments have looked at national development in various sectors. Since we got to bring up our people, which were really down in the very poverty level at this time of independence, we could not afford to spend all the money, even if we wanted, on the military. But yet, I think we're building up. And as briefly mentioned by Probal, I think we need to look at alliances on what we need basis. Because one thing we need to remember, that in politics, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. It is how we need to look after only purely national interests. So things like Quad, where we have been exercising with these countries, Australia had gone out for some time, then they came back in. We have been having a regular thing in Japan, the countries he mentioned, actually Australia. Then you have Singapore, you have Vietnam. And the other side, you have Israel. For a long time, we did not even have diplomatic relations with them. But now today, we have a very good relationship with them. We get technology and equipment, what we need for the armed forces from them. So all these you got to look at as a whole and decide what exactly is good for us. And we have no option that, given our size, our location, and our position and prominence that we chose to play, like our Prime Minister spoke of the Sagar, which is actually you're looking at security and growth for all in the region, which means we are interested in the entire Indo-Pacific development. We got to play a part. So therefore, while you see the Chinese are moving in with the talk of a string of pearls or one road, one belt initiative coming all over, we need to counter them in our own way, and we need to stand firm and with a resolve. Otherwise, you will find that, you will be a second-grade power. Now, we are the only nation, if you look at various other aspects, which can actually match up to Chinese in the long run. And that, I think they realize that, and they do long-term thinking. So we also got to think of it in the long term and essentially develop our requirements. So till we develop that, we may have to, observe a bit of prudence while building up. But yes, moment you stand firm, this is again where I think 67 showed what's so amply brought out the book. That bit realized, that's why they thought twice before getting in 71. So we have to develop on our own. Otherwise, we have no option but to do that. Mohit, next question.
I think next question is very interesting because it comes from a very noted gynecologist. And she understands how the birthing happens, but she also wants to know what is our stance on the Indo-China relationships at this point of time. Dr. Neeta, would you like to ask a question, please? Dr. Neeta?
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Probal, while I've not read your book, but what you talked about was very enlightening. And obviously the very, the topmost, I mean, it's a huge concern for all of us. And we are all concerned, actually speaking, frankly speaking, will there be a war? And what is our position, our stance? We see this now against China, the standoff, and I don't know whether the news is filtered to us, and we also don't understand. I mean, we keep hearing from the news, but what really is our stance with China now? And this oft heard news of war on the brink. Of course, as an ordinary citizen of India, I'm very concerned. So I just wanted to know what's your reading into it, knowing the past, which you have described so beautifully about the dynamics of relationship, which you have described so beautifully in the past. What do you think? And we have great guests here, and I'd love to know what they think about it. I mean, it's a question in all our minds.
Thank you, Ms. Thapar. I think the audio was not probably very prominent at my end, and I kind of missed
let me read the
some
question.
part of the question. Am I Yeah.
There's some echo from your side, Probal, but if you want, I can read the question for you. She has also posted it. So her question is, in the scenario of today,
I think yeah.
How well are we positioned against China when the tensions are nearly at a breaking point?
Sure. So, I mean, as far as that's a big question in terms of headline question where we would go. I think this entire year has been a tussle, and if you look at the way the year has traveled, or India and China have traveled through the year, you will see that the standoff started early part of the year. It has had several kind of nodal points and several twists and turns. And I'll arrive at the answer. My thoughts on your question is that if you look at and then China breaking the protocol, taking advantage. There was a lot of pressure that India wasn't doing much, or China had come in. China had struck India, taken out Indian soldiers, but had broken the protocol in the process. What would India do? India had also retaliated at that point of time. Some information was there in the media, sketchy information about how many what happened, etc., especially in the Chinese media, which kind of hid that information about casualties towards their own soldiers, which had taken place, etc., etc. All of that had happened. The reason why I say that is, and thereafter India went up and occupied the Kailash ranges, which resulted in a complete lock. They were locked into, there was a lockdown, and sort of, there was a situation where no one could move anywhere. China also realized that, look, the Indians have taken the heights, and though we had struck first, we had shown a lot of aggression, the Indians are not going to back down. This is something, when you look at confrontations and wars, they are also an outcome of what the enemy perceives of you. In 1962, the war happened, and before that, there were certain Chinese actions that had happened which India did not read, or did not read well enough, or the political decision making at that point and the military leadership at that point was not good enough to read those decisions. And therefore China thought that this was the time to go into war. So a nation goes into war when it knows its adversary is ready to be, when its adversary is not ready, or when it feels that this is the time that they can actually put it across their adversary. 1962, they felt that. 67, at a very limited level, in the local level, they still had that thought. Today, what they started with in early part of 2020, somewhere along the line, the Indians went up, and you would have read in the news, occupied the heights, the Tibetan commandos, and the forces. So that happened, which resulted in China being given a message that, look, this is not going to be easy for them. So to answer your question, I personally don't think that there is a possibility of a larger war happening at this point. However, there are tussles at several levels. At this point, the economies of the two large states cannot afford to get into a war of a nature of 1962, where the armies get into a confrontation of a larger kind. However, today there is a possibility of several tussles happening at several places. And what we saw in Tibet is one part of it, which could continue elsewhere as well. Ever since Xi Jinping has become the premier of China in 2013, before this, there were 7 standoffs. And the 7 standoffs that have come is also a result of China's deeper, larger ambition, driven by its thought of Tianxia, which is, it believes it's the central kingdom. It's the heaven under the earth. And therefore, it must occupy a larger space. It wanted to show India that, look, this is a place wherein they are the bigger power. India retaliated and gave them a very fitting, strong response. So given all of that, the Chinese do not think, that's what I think, the Chinese are not in a position to believe that they can have a war and go back in the same way that they did in 1962, which again makes you think that the possibility of a large-scale war is remote. If you look at what changes that Chinese have made at their end, the general was responsible for most of these 7 standoffs against India and the 9. I'm talking about facts, in the last 6-7 years, and he was also the theater commander. General Shao Zhongqi, has been replaced by another general, and that is possibly a result of an understanding the Chinese have believed now that, look, this is not possible, because General Zhongqi was one of the more aggressive theater commanders, and who was the architect of all that had happened in Tibet in 2020. So that general has been replaced by Xi Jinping. So which is a major indicator that, look, and also the talks have happened in the last few months. So my understanding is that the chances of a full-scale war are remote. However, India and China would we are in for a longer haul as far as the standoff is concerned, as far as the confrontation on several fronts with China is concerned, and that's going to go on for a longer time than what we would like to think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Neeta. I think Vice Admiral Muralidharan, we have stretched. Colonel Thapar would like to say something, please.
Yeah, I just want to take off from where Probal has left. The fact is that at one moment of time, we had one company at Gyansi in Chumbi Valley. That was sent back. Then they took on closing the Nathula Pass. This is after 58 that all these things happened. And we have been always saying that the Chumbi Valley is a dagger in what this strategic thinking, how it was implemented or translated on the ground. It was neglected, and that is why we had 65 and 67. Small points, there are 2 points I have. One is about two passes that could be mentioned where action had taken place. One was Cebula and one was Yakla. At that time, Fort Para Company was holding, even captured a Chinese prisoner, Hawalda. So that is about. And lastly, I have great happiness and satisfaction in telling you, as the author of this book, that I was the one who suggested the idea of occupying Camel's Back and physically went and occupied it. That paid the largest dividends in 1967. Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any more questions, Mohit, or
I think that we have already stretched by almost 25 minutes.
Yeah, I'll just take a minute and then I will hand it over back to you.
Yeah.
I'm sure all the audience here and those who have not listened, you must read Probal's book. Those who have not read it, it's a very fascinating account, and actually I couldn't put it down, so I virtually read it starting from his prologue to the epilogue all the way, and it covers the entire gamut. And if you come to the battle scenes, etc., is actually described. When you read it, you feel actually you were there and experiencing it and going back all these years. But more importantly, I think the takeaway that we need to take is that we need to reflect on past and think about our positives, and that must be where we have been succeeded. That must really be given to our youngsters, to youth, so that we get over the psyche that we are not. It's like, if I want to borrow a parlance, it's like how Indian cricket team never won matches for a long time, and once they won the first test match, they could they realized that you could take on anybody else. In the military field, of course, it's more. And we got to remember that China is going to remain very much, if you don't want to use the term adversary, you might like to say competitor for the world strategic space, for the importance, whether it be in, economically or otherwise. So as a nation, we need to develop, and we need to stand firm on our issues and policies. And people are testing you out. If you actually see, I don't think China is really keen on settling despite our having the peace and tranquility agreement, etc. Nobody wants to settle the border issues. Something that will keep simmer over. When they think that you're a little weak, they try to test it out. In 2020, they did that. We are firm on it. Now, yesterday, you must have seen the newspaper, the message from the army chief on the occasion of Army Day, saying that how we will stand firm and we'll tackle everything else. Now, that's the kind of firmness that we have, which our Prime Minister also been saying. So then all these nations will think twice, and ultimately it is our national interest and what it is. And I would like to leave one thought which was quoted by a very senior diplomat. It had come a few months back at the height of the Chinese it had come in an article in the Hindu, which said about Indira Gandhi talking to, again, maybe slightly dated with 30, 40 years old before that. She talked of the time when she said, maybe 50 years down the line, we would be very friendly with Pakistan. But with China, we got to always tread with caution. It was her vision, it was her thinking. We can extrapolate it, think the way that we want. I must once again thank Probal for the wonderful book that is written, and to Mohit and CBL for giving me the opportunity to be with us. And I must also thank Colonel Thapar for actually giving us, because he's the only one amongst us who has been on the ground situation there in 65 and 67. Thank you, Mohit. Over to you.
Truly a pleasure, sir. I must say, though we have overstretched, but this was like watching a movie, and that too with so much of action into it. But as a civilian, my only suggestion to everyone who would be listening this on the live video as well is that there are soldiers on the border. They are covering it from all fields and all three kind of defense systems that we have. But as civilians, it's our duty to behave in a way that we encourage our soldiers that they are we are worth fighting for. That's what my view on this would be. And I definitely look forward to reading this book. And I look forward to possibly a great movie being made on this, or possibly a web series to be made on this, Probal. And many congratulations for the book. This is a fantastic book. Just to end, we got a poll done, and we actually asked that, have we done enough to tell our glorious past? Most of the participants said no. We asked how many of you actually knew about the 1967 war and the victory? Most of them were not aware about it. In fact, close to 60% and plus. We even asked whether we should teach military tactics, strategy, and international affairs as part, or the geopolitics as part of the B school education. Most of them have clearly said a yes to it. And also a very strong vote on, would you like to read the book and discuss it with Probal very soon? Most of them have said a yes. So Probal, we'll see you again and would love to have, and by the time people would be able to know where is Colonel Thapar in this book at the page 60 and so much. And Vice Admiral, we would love to have you to moderate that session again, and a special thanks to everyone who could join in, Mr. Karnik, Dr. Neeta, and many others who could join this History Book Club session today. Thanks a lot and have a great evening. Have a great Sunday evening ahead. Thank you, Probal. Thank you, Vice Admiral Muralidharan. Thank you, Colonel Thapar. Yet again, Jai Hind, Namaskar.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.